The Sphinx Apple, by O. Henry. 20 miles out from Paradise, and 15 miles short of Sunrise City, Bildad Rose, the stage driver, stopped his team. A furious snow had been falling all day. 8 inches it measured now, on a level. The remainder of the road was not without peril in daylight, creeping along the ribs of a bijou range of ragged mountains. Now, when both snow and night masked its dangers, further travel was not to be thought of, said Bildad Rose. So he pulled up his 4 stout horses and delivered to his 5 passengers oral deductions of his wisdom. Judge Menifee, to whom men granted leadership and the initiatory as upon a silver salver, sprang from the coach at once. 4 of his fellow passengers followed, inspired by his example, ready to explore, to objurgate, to resist, to submit, to proceed, according as their prime factor might be inclined to sway them. The 5th passenger, a young woman, remained in the coach. Bildad had halted upon the shoulder of the first mountain spur. 2 rail fences, ragged black, hemmed the road. 50 yards above the upper fence, showing a dark blot in the white drifts, stood a small house. Upon this house descended, or rather ascended Judge Menifee and his cohorts with boyish whoops born of the snow and stress. They called, they pounded at window and door. At the inhospitable silence they waxed restive. They assaulted and forced the pregnable barriers and invaded the premises. The watchers from the coach heard stumblings and shoutings from the interior of the ravaged house. Before long a light within flickered, glowed, flamed high and bright and cheerful. Then came running back through the driving flakes the exuberant explorers. More deeply pitched than the clarion even orchestral in volume, the voice of Judge Menifee proclaimed the succor that lay in apposition with their state of travail. The one room of the house was uninhabited, he said, and bare of furniture. But it contained a great fireplace, and they had discovered an ample store of chopped wood in a lean-to at the rear. Housing and warmth against the shivering night were thus assured. For the placation of Bildad Rose there was news of a stable, not ruined beyond service, with hay in a loft, near the house. "Gentlemen," cried Bildad Rose from his seat, swathed in coats and robes, "tear me down 2 panels of that fence, so I can drive in. That is old man Rudruth's shanty. I thought we must be nigh it." They took him to the foolish house in August. Cheerfully the 4 passengers sprang at the snow-capped rails. The exhorted team tugged the coach up the slant to the door of the edifice from which a midsummer madness had ravished its proprietor. The driver and 2 of the passengers began to unhitch. Judge Menifee opened the door of the coach and removed his hat. "I have to announce, Miss Garland," said he, "the enforced suspension of our journey. The driver asserts that the risk in traveling the mountain road by night is too great even to consider. It will be necessary to remain in the shelter of this house until morning. I beg that you will feel that there is nothing to fear beyond a temporary inconvenience. I have personally inspected the house, and find that there are means to provide against the rigor of the weather, at least. You shall be made as comfortable as possible. Permit me to assist you to alight." To the judge's side came the passenger whose pursuit in life was the placing of the little Goliath windmill. His name was Dunwoody, but that matters not much. In traveling merely from Paradise to Sunrise City one needs little or no name. Still, one who would seek to divide honors with Judge Madison L. Menifee deserves a cognominal peg upon which fame may hang a wreath. Thus spake, loudly and buoyantly, the aerial miller. "Guess you'll have to climb out of the ark, Mrs. McFarland. This wigwam isn't exactly the Palmer house, but it turns snow, and they won't search your grip for souvenir spoons when you leave. We've got a fire going, and we'll fix you up with dry tilbies and keep the mice away. Anyhow, all right, all right." One of the 2 passengers who were struggling in a melee of horses, harness, snow, and the sarcastic injunctions of Bildad Rose, called loudly from the whirl of his volunteer duties, "Say, some of you fellows get Miss Solomon into the house, will you? Whoa there, you confounded brute." Again must it be gently urged that in traveling from Paradise to Sunrise City an accurate name is prodigality. When Judge Menifee, sanctioned to the act by his gray hair and widespread repute, had introduced himself to the lady passenger, she had, herself, sweetly breathed a name. In response, that the hearing of the male passengers had variously interpreted. In the not unjealous spirit of rivalry that eventuated, each clung stubbornly to his own theory. For the lady passenger to have reasseverated or corrected would have seemed didactic if not unduly solicitous of a specific acquaintance. Therefore the lady passenger permitted herself to be garlanded and McFarlanded and Solomon with equal and discreet complacency. It is 35 miles from Paradise to Sunrise City. Compagnon de voyage is name enough, by the gripsack of the wandering Jew, for so brief a journey. Soon the little party of wayfarers were happily seated in a cheerful ark before the roaring fire. The robes, cushions, and removable portions of the coach had been brought in and put to service. The lady passenger chose a place near the hearth at one end of the ark. There she graced almost a throne that her subjects had prepared. She sat upon cushions and leaned against an empty box and barrel, robe bespread, which formed a defense from the invading drafts. She extended her feet, delectably shod, to the cordial heat. She unloved her hands, but retained about her neck her long fur boa, the unstable flames half revealed, while the warding boa half submerged, her face, a youthful face, altogether feminine, clearly molded and calm with beauty's unchallenged confidence. Chivalry and manhood were here vying to please and comfort her. She seemed to accept their devoirs not piquantly, as one courted and attended, nor preeningly, as many of her sex unworthily reap their honors, not yet stolidly, as the ox receives his hay, but concordantly with nature's own plan as the lily ingests the drop of dew foreordained to its refreshment. Outside the wind roared mightily, the fine snow whizzed through the cracks, the cold besieged the backs of the immolated six, but the elements did not lack a champion that night. Judge Menifee was attorney for the storm. The weather was his client, and he strove by special pleading to convince his companions in that frigid jury box that they sojourned in a bower of roses, beset only by benignant zephyrs. He drew upon a fund of gaiety, wit, and anecdote, sophistical, but crowned with success. His cheerfulness communicated itself irresistibly. Each one hastened to contribute his own quota toward the general optimism. Even the lady passenger was moved to expression. "I think it is quite charming," she said, in her slow, crystal tones. At intervals someone of the passengers would rise and humorously explore the room. There was little evidence to be collected of its habitation by old man Redruth. Bildad Rose was called upon vivaciously for the ex-hermit's history. Now, since the stage driver's horses were fairly comfortable and his passengers appeared to be so, peace and comedy returned to him. "The old dapper," began Bildad, somewhat irreverently, "infested this here house about 20 year. He never allowed nobody to come nigh him. He'd duck his head inside and slam the door whenever a team drove along. There was spinning wheels up in his loft, all right. He used to buy his groceries and tobacco at Sam Tilly's store, on the Little Muddy. Last August he went up there dressed in a red bedquilt, and told Sam he was King Solomon, and that the Queen of Sheba was coming to visit him. He fetched along all the money he had, a little bag full of silver, and dropped it in Sam's well. 'She won't come,' says old man Redruth to Sam, 'if she knows I've got any money.' As soon as folks heard he had that sort of a theory about women and money, they knowed he was crazy, so they sent down and packed him to the foolish asylum." "Was there a romance in his life that drove him to a solitary existence?" asked one of the passengers, a young man who had an agency. "No," said Bildad, "not that I ever heard spoke of. Just ordinary trouble. They say he had had unfortunateness in the way of love derangements with a young lady when he was young, before he contracted red bedquilts and had his financial conclusions disqualified. I never heard of no romance." "Ah," exclaimed Judge Menifee, impressively, "a case of unrequited affection, no doubt." "No, sir," returned Bildad, "not at all. She never married him. Marmaduke Mulligan, down at Paradise, seen a man once that come from old Redruth's town. He said Redruth was a fine young man, but when you kicked him on the pocket, all you could hear jingle was a cuff fastener and a bunch of keys. He was engaged to this young lady, Miss Alice. Something was her name. I forgot. This man said she was the kind of girl you like to have reach across you in a car to pay the fare. Well, there come to the town a young chap all affluent and easy, and fixed up with buggies and mining stock in leisure time. Although she was a staked claim, Miss Alice and the new entry seemed to strike a mutual kind of a clip. They had calls and coincidences of going to the post office and such things as sometimes make a girl send back the engagement ring and other presents. A rift within the lute, the poetry man calls it. One day folks seen Rudruth and Miss Alice standing talking at the gate. Then he lifts his hat and walks away, and that was the last anybody in that town seen of him, as far as this man knew. "What about the young lady?" asked the young man who had an agency. "Never heard," answered Bildad. "Right there is where my load of information turns to an old spavined crowbait and folds its wings, for I've pumped it dry." "A very sad," began Judge Menifee, but his remark was curtailed by a higher authority. "What a charming story," said the lady passenger, in flute-like tones. A little silence followed, except for the wind and the crackling of the fire. The men were seated upon the floor, having slightly mitigated its inhospitable surface with wraps and stray pieces of boards. The man who was placing little Goliath windmills arose and walked about to ease his cramped muscles. Suddenly a triumphant shout came from him. He hurried back from a dusky corner of the room, bearing aloft something in his hand. It was an apple, a large, red-mottled, firm pippin, pleasing to behold. In a paper bag on a high shelf in that corner he had found it. It could have been no relic of the love-wrecked Ridgeruth, for its glorious soundness repudiated the theory that it had lain on that musty shelf since August. No doubt some recent bivouackers, lunching in the deserted house, had left it there. Dunwoody again, his exploits demand for him the honors of nomenclature, flaunted his apple in the faces of his fellow marooners. "See what I found, Mrs. McFarland," he cried, vaingloriously. He held the apple high up in the light of the fire, where it glowed a still richer red. The lady passenger smiled calmly, always calmly. "What a charming apple," she murmured, clearly. For a brief space Judge Menifee felt crushed, humiliated, relegated. Second place galled him. Why had this blatant, obtrusive, unpolished man of windmills been selected by fate instead of himself to discover the sensational apple? He could have made of the act a scene, a function, a setting for some impromptu, fanciful discourse or piece of comedy and have retained the role of cynosure. Actually, the lady passenger was regarding this ridiculous Dunbody or Wood Bundy with an admiring smile, as if the fellow had performed a feat, and the windmill man swelled and gyrated like a sample of his own goods, puffed up with the wind that ever blows from the chorus land toward the domain of the star. While the transported Dunwoody, with his Aladdin's apple, was receiving the fickle attentions of all, the resourceful jurist formed a plan to recover his own laurels. With his courtliest smile upon his heavy but classic features, Judge Menifee advanced and took the apple, as if to examine it, from the hand of Dunwoody. In his hand it became Exhibit A. "A fine apple," he said, approvingly. "Really, my dear Mr. Dunwoody, you have eclipsed all of us as a forager. But I have an idea. This apple shall become an emblem, a token, a symbol, a prize bestowed by the mind and heart of beauty upon the most deserving." The audience, except one, applauded. "Good on the stump, ain't he?" commented the passenger, who was nobody in particular to the young man who had an agency. The unresponsive one was the windmill man. He saw himself reduced to the ranks. Never would the thought have occurred to him to declare his apple an emblem. He had intended, after it had been divided and eaten, to create diversion by sticking the seeds against his forehead and naming them for young ladies of his acquaintance. One he was going to name Mrs. McFarland. The seed that fell off first would be, but 'twas too late now. "The apple," continued Judge Menifee, charging his jury, "in modern days occupies, though undeservedly, a lowly place in our esteem. Indeed, it is so constantly associated with the culinary and the commercial that it is hardly to be classed among the polite fruits. But in ancient times this was not so. Biblical, historical, and mythological lore abounds with evidences that the apple was the aristocrat of fruits. We still say the apple of the eye when we wish to describe something superlatively precious. We find in Proverbs the comparison to apples of silver. No other product of tree or vine has been so utilized in figurative speech. Who has not heard of and longed for the apples of the Hesperides? I need not call your attention to the most tremendous and significant instance of the apple's ancient prestige, when its consumption by our first parents occasioned the fall of man from his state of goodness and perfection. Apples like them, said the windmill man, lingering with the objective article, are worth $3.50 a barrel in the Chicago market. Now, what I have to propose, said Judge Menifee, conceding an indulgent smile to his interrupter, is this. We must remain here, perforce, until morning. We have wood in plenty to keep us warm. Our next need is to entertain ourselves as best we can, in order that the time shall not pass too slowly. I propose that we place this apple in the hands of Miss Garland. It is no longer a fruit, but, as I said, a prize, an award, representing a great human idea. Miss Garland, herself, shall cease to be an individual, but only temporarily. I am happy to add, a low bow, full of the old-time grace. She shall represent her sex. She shall be the embodiment, the epitome of womankind, the heart and brain, I may say, of God's masterpiece of creation. In this guise she shall judge and decide the question which follows. But a few minutes ago our friend, Mr. Rose, favored us with an entertaining but fragmentary sketch of the romance in the life of the former professor of this habitation. The few facts that we have learned seem to me to open up a fascinating field for conjecture, for the study of human hearts, for the exercise of the imagination, in short, for storytelling. Let us make use of the opportunity. Let each one of us relate his own version of the story of Ridgeruth, the hermit, and his lady love, beginning where Mr. Rose's narrative ends, the parting of the lovers at the gate. This much should be assumed and conceded, that the young lady was not necessarily to blame for Ridgeruth's becoming a crazed and world-hating hermit. When we have done, Miss Garland shall render the judgment of woman. As the spirit of her sex, she shall decide which version of the story best and most truly depicts human and love interest, and most faithfully estimates the character and acts of Ridgeruth's betrothed according to the feminine view. The apple shall be bestowed upon him who is awarded the decision. If you are all agreed, we shall be pleased to hear the first story from Mr. Dinwiddie. The last sentence captured the windmill man. He was not one to linger in the dumps. That's a first-rate scheme, Judge, he said, heartily. Be a regular short story vaudeville, won't it? I used to be correspondent for a paper in Springfield, and when there wasn't any news I faked it. Guess I can do my turn all right. I think the idea is charming, said the lady passenger, brightly. It will be almost like a game. Judge Menifee stepped forward and placed the apple in her hand impressively. In olden days, he said, oratonely, Paris awarded the golden apple to the most beautiful. I was at the exposition, remarked the windmill man, now cheerful again, but I never heard of it, and I was on the Midway, too. All the time I wasn't at the machinery exhibit. But now, continued the judge, the fruit shall translate to us the mystery and wisdom of the feminine heart. Take the apple, Miss Garland. Here are modest tales of romance, and then award the prize as you may deem it just. The lady passenger smiled sweetly. The apple lay in her lap beneath her robes and wraps. She reclined against her protecting bulwark, brightly and cozily at ease. But for the voices and the wind one might have listened hopefully to hear her purr. Someone cast fresh logs upon the fire. Judge Menifee nodded suavely. Will you oblige us with the initial story? He asked. The windmill man sat as sits a Turk, with his hat well back on his head on account of the drafts. Well, he began, without any embarrassment, this is about the way I size up the difficulty. Of course Ridgeruth was jostled a good deal by this duck who had money to play ball with, who tried to cut him out of his girl. So he goes around, naturally, and asks her if the game is still square. Well, nobody wants a guy cutting in with buggies and gold bonds when he's got an option on a girl. Well, he goes around to see her. Well, maybe he's hot, and talks like the proprietor, and forgets that an engagement ain't always a lead pipe cinch. Well, I guess that makes Alice warm under the lacy yoke. Well, she answers back sharp. Well, he... Say, interrupted the passenger who was nobody in particular. If you could put up a windmill on every one of them wells you're using, you'd be able to retire from business, wouldn't you? The windmill man grinned good-naturedly. Oh, I ain't no guy to Maupassant, he said, cheerfully. I'm giving it to you in straight American. Well, she says something like this, Mr. Gold Bonds is only a friend, says she, but he takes me riding and buys me theater tickets, and that's what you never do. Ain't I to never have any pleasure in life while I can? Pass this Chatfield thing along, says Rudruth. Hand out the mitt to the willy with creases in it, or you don't put your slippers under my wardrobe. Now that kind of train orders don't go with a girl that's got any spirit. I bet that girl loved her honey all the time. Maybe she only wanted, as girls do, to work the good thing for a little fun and caramels before she settled down to patch George's other pair and be a good wife. But he is glued to the high horse and won't come down. Well, she hands him back the ring, proper enough, and George goes away and hits the booze. Yep, that's what done it. I bet that girl fired the cornucopia with the fancy vest 2 days after her steady left. George boards a freight and checks his bag of crackers for parts unknown. He sticks to old booze for a number of years, and then the aniline and aquafortis gets the decision. Me for the hermit's hut, says George, and the long whiskers, and the buried can of money that isn't there. But that Alice, in my mind, was on the level. She never married, but took up typewriting as soon as the wrinkles began to show, and kept a cat that came when you said, weenie, weenie, weenie. I got too much faith in good women to believe they throw down the fellow they're stuck on every time for the dough. The windmill man ceased. I think, said the lady passenger, slightly moving upon her lowly throne, that is a char. Oh, Miss Garland, interposed Judge Menifee with uplifted hand, I beg of you, no comments. It would not be fair to the other contestants. Mr. Or will you take the next turn? The judge addressed the young man who had the agency. My version of the romance, began the young man, diffidently clasping his hands, would be this. They did not quarrel when they parted. Mr. Redruth bade her goodbye and went out into the world to seek his fortune. He knew his love would remain true to him. He scorned the thought that his rival could make an impression upon a heart so fond and faithful. I would say that Mr. Redruth went out to the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming to seek for gold. One day a crew of pirates landed and captured him while at work, and— Hey, what's that? Sharply called the passenger who was nobody in particular. A crew of pirates landed in the Rocky Mountains. Will you tell us how they sailed? Landed from a train, said the narrator, quietly and not without some readiness. They kept him prisoner in a cave for months, and then they took him hundreds of miles away to the forests of Alaska. There a beautiful Indian girl fell in love with him, but he remained true to Alice. After another year of wandering in the woods, he set out with the diamonds. What diamonds? Asked the unimportant passenger, almost with acerbity. The ones the saddle-maker showed him in the Peruvian temple, said the other, somewhat obscurely. When he reached home, Alice's mother led him, weeping, to a green mound under a willow tree. Her heart was broken when you left, said her mother. And what of my rival of Chester Mackintosh? Asked Mr. Redruth, as he knelt sadly by Alice's grave. When he found out, she answered, that her heart was yours, he pined away day by day until, at length, he started a furniture store in Grand Rapids. We heard lately that he was bitten to death by an infuriated moose near South Bend, Indiana, where he had gone to try to forget scenes of civilization. With which, Mr. Redruth forsook the face of mankind and became a hermit, as we have seen. My story, concluded the young man with an agency, may lack the literary quality, but what I wanted it to show is that the young lady remained true. She cared nothing for wealth in comparison with true affection. I admire and believe in the fair sex too much to think otherwise. The narrator ceased, with a sidelong glance at the corner where reclined the lady passenger. Bildad Rose was next invited by Judge Menifee to contribute his story in the contest for the Apple of Judgment. The stage driver's essay was brief. I'm not one of them Lobo wolves, he said, who are always blaming on women the calamities of life. My testimony in regards to the fiction story you ask for, Judge, will be about as follows. What ailed Redruth was pure laziness. If he had up and slugged this Percival de Lacy that tried to give him the outside of the road, and had kept Alice in the grapevine swing with the blind bridle on, all would have been well. The woman you want is sure worth taking pains for. Send for me if you want me again, says Redruth, and hoists his Stetson and walks off. He'd have called it pride, but the nixicomological name for it is laziness. No woman don't like to run after a man. Let him come back, hisself, says the girl, and I'll be bound she tells the boy with the pay or to trot, and then spends her time watching out the window for the man with the empty pocketbook and the tickly mustache. I reckon Redruth waits about 9 years expecting her to send him a note by a nigger asking him to forgive her, but she don't. This game won't work, says Redruth. Then so won't I. And he goes in the hermit business and raises whiskers. Yes, laziness and whiskers was what done the trick. They travel together. You ever hear of a man with long whiskers and hair striking a bonanza? No. Look at the Duke of Marlborough and this Standard Oil snoozer. Have they got him? Now, this Alice didn't never marry, I'll bet a hoss. If Redruth had married somebody else she might have done so, too. But he never turns up. She has these here things they call fond memories, and maybe a lock of hair and a corset steel that he broke, treasured up. Them sort of articles is as good as a husband to some women. I'd say she played out a lone hand. I don't blame no woman for old man Redruth's abandonment of barber shops and clean shirts. Next in order came the passenger who was nobody in particular. Nameless to us, he travels the road from Paradise to Sunrise City. But him you shall see, if the firelight be not too dim, as he responds to the judge's call. A lean form, in rusty brown clothing, sitting like a frog, his arms wrapped about his legs, his chin resting upon his knees. Smooth, oakum-colored hair, long nose, mouth like a satyr's, with upturned, tobacco-stained corners. An eye like a fish's, a red necktie with a horseshoe pin. He began with a rasping chuckle that gradually formed itself into words. Everybody wrong so far. What? A romance without any orange blossoms. Ho, ho. My money on the lad with the butterfly tie and the certified checks in his trouserings. Take him as they parted at the gate? All right. You never loved me, says Redruth wildly, or you wouldn't speak to a man who can buy you the ice cream. I hate him, says she. I loathe his sidebar buggy. I despise the elegant cream bonbons he sends me in gilt boxes covered with real lace. I feel that I could stab him to the heart when he presents me with a solid medallion locket with turquoises and pearls running in a vine around the border. Away with him. 'Tis only you I love. Back to the cozy corner, says Redruth. Was I bound and lettered in East Aurora? Get platonic, if you please. No jackpots for mine. Go and hate your friend some more. For me the Nickerson girl on Avenue B, and gum, and a trolley ride. Around that night comes John W. Croesus. What? Tears, says he, arranging his pearl pin. You have driven my lover away, says little Alice, sobbing. I hate the sight of you. Marry me, then, says John W., lighting a Henry Clay. What? She cries indignantly. Marry you. Never, she says, until this blows over, and I can do some shopping, and you see about the license. There's a telephone next door if you want to call up the county clerk. The narrator paused to give vent to his cynical chuckle. Did they marry? He continued. Did the duck swallow the June bug? And then I take up the case of old boy Redruth. There's where you are all wrong again, according to my theory. What turned him into a hermit? One says laziness. One says remorse. One says booze. I say women did it. How old is the old man now? Asked the speaker, turning to Bildad Rose. I should say about 65. All right. He conducted his hermit shop here for 20 years. Say he was 25 when he took off his hat at the gate. That leaves 20 years for him to account for, or else be docked. Where did he spend that 10 and 2 fives? I'll give you my idea. Up for bigamy. Say there was the fat blonde in St. Joe, and the Panatella brunette at Skillet Ridge, and the gold tooth down in the Caw Valley. Redruth gets his cases mixed, and they send him up the road. He gets out after they are through with him, and says, any line for me except the crinoline. The hermit trade is not overdone, and the stenographers never apply to him for work. The jolly hermit's life for me. No more long hairs in the comb or dill pickles lying around in the cigar tray. You tell me they pinched old Rudruth for the noodle villa just because he said he was King Solomon? Figs. He was Solomon. That's all of mine. I guess it don't call for any apples. Enclosed fine stamps. It don't sound much like a prize winner. Respecting the stricture laid by Judge Menifee against comments upon the stories, all were silent when the passenger who was nobody in particular had concluded. And then the ingenious originator of the contest cleared his throat to begin the ultimate entry for the prize. Though seated with small comfort upon the floor, you might search in vain for any abatement of dignity in Judge Menifee. The now diminishing firelight played softly upon his face, as clearly chiseled as a Roman emperor's on some old coin, and upon the thick waves of his honorable gray hair. "A woman's heart," he began, in even but thrilling tones. "Who can hope to fathom it? The ways and desires of men are various. I think that the hearts of all women beat with the same rhythm, and to the same old tune of love. Love, to a woman, means sacrifice. If she be worthy of the name, no gold or rank will outweigh with her a genuine devotion. Gentlemen of the I should say, my friends, the case of Redruth versus love and affection has been called. Yet, who is on trial? Not Redruth, for he has been punished. Not those immortal passions that clothe our lives with the joy of the angels. Then who? Each man of us here tonight stands at the bar to answer if chivalry or darkness inhabits his bosom. To judge us sits womankind in the form of one of its fairest flowers. In her hand she holds the prize, intrinsically insignificant, but worthy of our noblest efforts to win as a guerdon of approval from so worthy a representative of feminine judgment and taste. In taking up the imaginary history of Redruth and the fair being to whom he gave his heart, I must, in the beginning, raise my voice against the unworthy insinuation that the selfishness or perfidy or love of luxury of any woman drove him to renounce the world. I have not found woman to be so unspiritual or venal. We must seek elsewhere, among man's baser nature and lower motives for the cause. There was, in all probability, a lover's quarrel as they stood at the gate on that memorable day. Tormented by jealousy, young Redruth vanished from his native haunts. But had he just cause to do so? There is no evidence for or against, but there is something higher than evidence. There is the grand, eternal belief in woman's goodness, in her steadfastness against temptation, in her loyalty even in the face of proffered riches. I picture to myself the rash lover, wandering, self-tortured, about the world. I picture his gradual descent, and finally, his complete despair when he realizes that he has lost the most precious gift life had to offer him. Then his withdrawal from the world of sorrow and the subsequent derangement of his faculties becomes intelligible. But what do I see on the other hand? A lonely woman fading away as the years roll by, still faithful, still waiting, still watching for a form and listening for a step that will come no more. She is old now. Her hair is white and smoothly banded. Each day she sits at the door and gazes longingly down the dusty road. In spirit she is waiting there at the gate, just as he left her his forever, but not here below. Yes, my belief in woman paints that picture in my mind, parted forever on earth, but waiting, she in anticipation of a meeting in Elysium, he in the slough of despond. "I thought he was in the bug house," said the passenger who was nobody in particular. Judge Menifee stirred, a little impatiently. The men sat, drooping, in grotesque attitudes. The wind had abated its violence, coming now in fitful, virulent puffs. The fire had burned to a mass of red coals which shed but a dim light within the room. The lady passenger in her cozy nook looked to be but a formless dark bulk, crowned by a mass of coiled, sleek hair and showing but a small space of snowy forehead above her clinging boa. Judge Menifee got stiffly to his feet. "And now, Miss Garland," he announced, "we have concluded. It is for you to award the prize to the one of us whose argument especially, I may say, in regard to his estimate of true womanhood approaches nearest to your own conception." No answer came from the lady passenger. Judge Menifee bent over solicitously. The passenger, who was nobody in particular, laughed low and harshly. The lady was sleeping sweetly. The judge essayed to take her hand to awaken her. In doing so, he touched a small, cold, round, irregular something in her lap. "She has eaten the apple," announced Judge Menifee in odd tones, as he held up the core for them to see. The Sparrows in Madison Square, by O. Henry. The young man in straitened circumstances who comes to New York City to enter literature has but one thing to do, provided he has studied carefully his field in advance. He must go straight to Madison Square, write an article about the sparrows there, and sell it to the Sun for $15. I cannot recall either a novel or a story dealing with the popular theme of the young writer from the provinces who comes to the metropolis to win fame and fortune with his pen, in which the hero does not get his start that way. It does seem strange that some author, in casting about for startlingly original plots, has not hit upon the idea of having his hero write about the bluebirds in Union Square and sell it to the Herald. But a search through the files of metropolitan fiction counts up overwhelmingly for the Sparrows and the old Garden Square, and the Sun always writes the check. Of course, it is easy to understand why this first city venture of the budding author is always successful. He is primed by necessity to a superlative effort. Mid the iron and stone and marble of the roaring city, he has found this spot of singing birds and green grass and trees. Every tender sentiment in his nature is baffling with the sweet pain of homesickness. His genius is aroused as it never may be again. The birds chirp, the tree branches sway, the noise of wheels is forgotten. He writes with his soul in his pen, and he sells it to the Sun for $15. I had read of this custom during many years before I came to New York. When my friends were using their strongest arguments to dissuade me from coming, I only smiled serenely. They did not know of that sparrow graft I had up my sleeve. When I arrived in New York, and the car took me straight from the ferry up 23rd Street to Madison Square, I could hear that $15 check rustling in my inside pocket. I obtained lodging at an unhyphenated hostelry, and the next morning I was on a bench in Madison Square almost by the time the sparrows were awake. Their melodious chirping, the benignant spring foliage of the noble trees, and the clean, fragrant grass reminded me so potently of the old farm I had left that tears almost came into my eyes. Then, all in a moment, I felt my inspiration. The brave, piercing notes of those cheerful small birds formed a keynote to a wonderful, light, fanciful song of hope and joy and altruism. Like myself, they were creatures with hearts pitched to the tune of woods and fields. As I was, so were they captives by circumstance in the discordant, dull city, yet with how much grace and glee they bore the restraint. And then the early morning people began to pass through the square to their work-sullen people, with sidelong glances and glum faces, hurrying, 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 and I got my theme cut out clear from the bird notes, and wrought it into a lesson, and a poem, and a carnival dance, and a lullaby, and then translated it all into prose and began to write. For 2 hours my pencil traveled over my pad with scarcely a rest. Then I went to the little room I had rented for 2 days, and there I cut it to half, and then mailed it, white-hot, to the Sun. The next morning I was up by daylight and spent 2 cents of my capital for a paper. If the word sparrow was in it, I was unable to find it. I took it up to my room and spread it out on the bed and went over it, column by column. Something was wrong. 3 hours afterward the postman brought me a large envelope containing my MS and a piece of inexpensive paper about 3 inches by 4. I suppose some of you have seen them, upon which was written in violet ink, with the Sun's thanks. I went over to the square and sat upon a bench. No, I did not think it necessary to eat any breakfast that morning. The confounded pests of sparrows were making the square hideous with their idiotic, cheap. I never saw birds so persistently noisy, impudent, and disagreeable in all my life. By this time, according to all traditions, I should have been standing in the office of the editor of the Sun. That personage, a tall, grave, white-haired man, would strike a silver bell as he grasped my hand and wiped a suspicious moisture from his glasses. "Mr. McChesney," he would be saying when a subordinate appeared, "this is Mr. Henry, the young man who sent in that exquisite gem about the sparrows in Madison Square. You may give him a desk at once. Your salary, sir, will be $80 a week, to begin with." This was what I had been led to expect by all writers who have evolved romances of literary New York. Something was decidedly wrong with tradition. I could not assume the blame, so I fixed it upon the sparrows. I began to hate them with intensity and heat. At that moment, an individual wearing an excess of whiskers, 2 hats, and a pestilential air slid into the seat beside me. "Say, Willie," he muttered cajolingly, "could you cough up a dime out of your coffers for a cup of coffee this morning?" "I'm lung-weary, my friend," said I. "The best I can do is 3 cents. "And you look like a gentleman, too," said he. "What brung you down? Boozer?" "Birds," I said fiercely. The brown-throated songsters caroling songs of hope and cheer to weary man toiling amid the city's dust and din. The little feathered couriers from the meadows and woods chirping sweetly to us of blue skies and flowering fields. The confounded little squint-eyed nuisances yawping like a flock of steam pianos and stuffing themselves like aldermen with grass seeds and bugs, while a man sits on a bench and goes without his breakfast. Yes, sir, birds. Look at them. As I spoke, I picked up a dead tree branch that lay by the bench and hurled it with all my force into a close congregation of the sparrows on the grass. The flock flew to the trees with a babble of shrill cries, but 2 of them remained prostrate upon the turf. In a moment my unsavory friend had leaped over the row of benches and secured the fluttering victims, which he thrust hurriedly into his pockets. Then he beckoned me with a dirty forefinger. "Come on, Cully," he said hoarsely. "You're in on the feed." "Thank you very much." Weakly I followed my dingy acquaintance. He led me away from the park down a side street and through a crack in a fence into a vacant lot where some excavating had been going on. Behind a pile of old stones and lumber he paused and took out his birds. "I got matches," said he. "You got any paper to start a fire with?" I drew forth my manuscript story of the sparrows and offered it for burnt sacrifice. There were old planks, splinters, and chips for our fire. My frosy friend produced from some interior of his frayed clothing half a loaf of bread, pepper, and salt. In 10 minutes, each of us was holding a sparrow spitted upon a stick over the leaping flames. "Say," said my fellow bivouacker, "this ain't so bad when a fellow's hungry. It reminds me of when I struck New York first about 15 years ago. I come in from the west to see if I could get a job on a newspaper. I hit the Madison Square Park the first morning after and was sitting around on the benches. I noticed the sparrows chirping and the grass and trees so nice and green that I thought I was back in the country again. Then I got some papers out of my pocket and—" "I know," I interrupted. "You sent it to the Sun and got $15. "Say," said my friend suspiciously, "you seem to know a good deal. Where was you?" "I went to sleep on the bench there in the sun, and somebody touched me for every cent I had, $15. The Song and the Sergeant, by O. Henry. Half a dozen people supping at a table in one of the Upper Broadway all-night restaurants were making too much noise. 3 times the manager walked past them with a politely warning glance, but their argument had waxed too warm to be quelled by a manager's gaze. It was midnight, and the restaurant was filled with patrons from the theaters of that district. Some among the dispersed audiences must have recognized among the quarrelsome sextet the faces of the players belonging to the Carroll Comedy Company. 4 of the 6 made up the company. Another was the author of the comedietta, A Gay Coquette, which the quartet of layers had been presenting with fair success at several vaudeville houses in the city. The 6th at the table was a person inconsequent in the realm of art, but one at whose bidding many lobsters had perished. Loudly the 6 maintained their clamorous debate. No one of the party was silent except when answers were stormed from him by the excited ones. That was the comedian of A Gay Coquette. He was a young man with a face even too melancholy for his profession. The oral warfare of 4 immoderate tongues was directed at Miss Clarice Carroll, the twinkling star of the small aggregation. Excepting the downcast comedian, all members of the party united in casting upon her with vehemence the blame of some momentous misfortune. 50 times they told her, "It is your fault, Clarice. It is you alone who spoilt the scene. It is only of late that you have acted this way. At this rate the sketch will have to be taken off." Miss Carroll was a match for any 4. Gallic ancestry gave her a vivacity that could easily mount to fury. Her large eyes flashed a scorching denial at her accusers. Her slender, Eloquent arms constantly menaced the tableware. Her high, clear soprano voice rose to what would have been a scream had it not possessed so pure a musical quality. She hurled back at the attacking four their denunciations in tones sweet, but of too great carrying power for a Broadway restaurant. Finally, they exhausted her patience both as a woman and an artist. She sprang up like a panther, managed to smash half a dozen plates and glasses with one royal sweep of her arm, and defied her critics. They rose and wrangled more loudly. The comedian sighed and looked a trifle sadder and disinterested. The manager came tripping and suggested peace. He was told to go to the popular synonym for war, so promptly that the affair might have happened at The Hague. Thus was the manager angered. He made a sign with his hand, and a waiter slipped out of the door. In 20 minutes, the party of 6 was in a police station facing a grizzled and philosophical desk sergeant. "Disorderly conduct in a restaurant," said the police man who had brought the party in. The author of A Gay Coquette stepped to the front. He wore nose glasses and evening clothes, even if his shoes had been tans before they met the patent leather polish bottle. "Mr. Sergeant," said he, out of his throat, like actor Irving, "I would like to protest against this arrest. The company of actors who are performing in a little play that I have written, in company with a friend and myself, were having a little supper. We became deeply interested in the discussion as to which one of the cast is responsible for a scene in the sketch that lately has fallen so flat that the piece is about to become a failure. We may have been rather noisy and intolerant of interruption by the restaurant people, but the matter was of considerable importance to all of us. You see that we are sober and are not the kind of people who desire to raise disturbances. I hope that the case will not be pressed and that we may be allowed to go." "Who makes the charge?" asked the sergeant. "Me," said a white-aproned voice in the rear. "The restaurant sent me to. The gang was raising a rough house and breaking dishes." "The dishes were paid for," said the playwright. "They were not broken purposely. In her anger, because we remonstrated with her for spoiling the scene, miss." "It's not true, Sergeant," cried the clear voice of Mississippi Clarice Carroll. In a long coat of tan silk and a red-plumed hat, she bounded before the desk. "It's not my fault," she cried indignantly. "How dare they say such a thing? I've played the title orally ever since it was staged, and if you want to know who made it a success, ask the public, that's all." "What Miss Carroll says is true in part," said the author. "For 5 months the comedietta was a drawing card in the best houses. But during the last 2 weeks it has lost favor. There is one scene in it in which Miss Carroll made a big hit. Now she hardly gets a hand out of it. She spoils it by acting it entirely different from her old way." "It is not my fault," reiterated the actress. "There are only 2 of you on in the scene," argued the playwright hotly. "You and Delmars here." "Then it's his fault," declared Miss Carroll, with a lightning glance of scorn from her dark eyes. The comedian caught it, and gazed with increased melancholy at the panels of the sergeant's desk. The night was a dull one in that particular police station. The sergeant's long-blunted curiosity awoke a little. "I've heard you," he said to the author, and then he addressed the thin-faced and ascetic-looking lady of the company who played Aunt Turniptop in the little comedy. "Who do you think spoils the scene you were fussing about?" he asked. "I'm no knocker," said that lady, "and everybody knows it. So, when I say that Clarice falls down every time in that scene, I'm judging her art and not herself. She was great in it once. She does it something fierce now. It'll dope the show if she keeps it up." The sergeant looked at the comedian. "You and the lady have this scene together, I understand. I suppose there's no use asking you which one of you queers it." The comedian avoided the direct rays from the 2 fixed stars of Miss Carroll's eyes. "I don't know," he said, looking down at his patent leather toes. "Are you one of the actors?" asked the sergeant of a dwarfish youth with a middle-aged face. "Why, say," replied the last thespian witness, "you don't notice any tin spear in my hands, do you? You haven't heard me shout, 'See, the Emperor comes,' since I've been in here, have you? I guess I'm on the stage long enough for him not to start a panic by mistaking me for a thin curl of smoke rising above the footlights." "In your opinion, if you've got one," said the sergeant, "is the frost that gathers on the scene in question the work of the lady or the gentleman who takes part in it?" The middle-aged youth looked pained. I regret to say, he answered, that Miss Carroll seems to have lost her grip on that scene. She's all right in the rest of the play, but I tell you, Sergeant, she can do it. She has done it equal to any of him, and she can do it again. Miss Carroll ran forward, glowing and palpitating. Thank you, Jimmy, for the first good word I've had in many a day, she cried. And then she turned her eager face toward the desk. I'll show you, Sergeant, whether I am to blame. I'll show them whether I can do that same. Come, Mr. Delmars, let us begin. You will let us, won't you, Sergeant? How long will it take? Asked the sergeant, dubiously. 8 minutes, said the playwright. The entire play consumes but 30. You may go ahead, said the sergeant. Most of you seem to side against the little lady. Maybe she had a right to crack up a saucer or two in that restaurant. We'll see how she does the turn before we take that up. The matron of the police station had been standing near, listening to the singular argument. She came nigher and stood near the sergeant's chair. 2 or 3 of the reserve strolled in, big and yawning. Before beginning the scene, said the playwright, and assuming that you have not seen a production of A Gay Coquette, I will make a brief but necessary explanation. It is a musical farce comedy, burlesque comedietta. As the title implies, Miss Carroll's Aurelie is that of a gay, rollicking, mischievous, heartless coquette. She sustains that character throughout the entire comedy part of the production, and I have designed the extravaganza features so that she may preserve and present the same coquettish idea. Now, the scene in which we take exception to Miss Carroll's acting is called the gorilla dance. She is costumed to represent a wood nymph, and there is a great song and dance scene with a gorilla, played by Mr. Delmars, the comedian. A tropical forest stage is set. That used to get 4 and 5 recalls. The main thing was the acting and the dance. It was the funniest thing in New York for 5 months. Delmars's song, I'll Woo Thee to My Sylvan Home, while he and Miss Carroll were cutting hide-and-seek capers among the tropical plants, was a winner. What's the trouble with the scene now? Asked the sergeant. Miss Carroll spoils it right in the middle of it, said the playwright wrathfully. With a wide gesture of her ever-moving arms, the actress waved back the little group of spectators, leaving a space in front of the desk for the scene of her vindication or fall. Then she whipped off her long tan cloak and tossed it across the arm of the policeman who still stood officially among them. Miss Carroll had gone to supper well cloaked, but in the costume of the tropic wood nymph. A skirt of fern leaves touched her knee. She was like a humming bird, green and golden and purple. And then she danced a fluttering, fantastic dance, so agile and light and mazy in her steps that the other 3 members of the Carroll Comedy Company broke into applause at the art of it. And at the proper time Delmars leaped out at her side, mimicking the uncouth, hideous bounds of the gorilla so funnily that the grizzled sergeant himself gave a short laugh like the closing of a padlock. They danced together the gorilla dance, and won a hand from all. Then began the most fantastic part of the scene, the wooing of the nymph by the gorilla. It was a kind of dance itself, eccentric and prankish, with the nymph coquettish and seductive retreat, followed by the gorilla as he sang, I'll woo thee to my sylvan home. The song was a lyric of merit. The words were nonsense, as befitted the play, but the music was worthy of something better. Delmars struck into it in a rich tenor that owned a quality that shamed the flippant words. During one verse of the song, the wood nymph formed the grotesque evolutions designed for the scene. At the middle of the second verse she stood still, with a strange look on her face, seeming to gaze dreamily into the depths of the scenic forest. The gorilla's last leap had brought him to her feet, and there he knelt, holding her hand, until he had finished the haunting lyric that was set in the absurd comedy like a diamond in a piece of putty. When Delmars ceased, Miss Carroll started, and covered a sudden flow of tears with both hands. There, cried the playwright, gesticulating with violence. There you have it, Sergeant. For 2 weeks she has spoiled that scene in just that manner at every performance. I have begged her to consider that it is not Ophelia or Juliet that she is playing. Do you wonder now at our impatience? Tears for the gorilla song. The play is lost. Out of her bewitchment, whatever it was, the wood nymph flared suddenly and pointed a desperate finger at Delmars. It is you, You who have done this, she cried wildly. You never sang that song that way until lately. It is your doing. I give it up, said the sergeant. And then the gray-haired matron of the police station came forward from behind the sergeant's chair. Must an old woman teach you all? She said. She went up to Miss Carroll and took her hand. The man's wearing his heart out for you, my dear. Couldn't you tell at the first note you heard him sing? All of his monkey flip-flops wouldn't have kept it from me. Must you be deaf as well as blind? That's why you couldn't act your part, child. Do you love him, or must he be a gorilla for the rest of his days? Miss Carroll whirled around and caught Delmars with a lightning glance of her eye. He came toward her, melancholy. Did you hear, Mr. Delmars? She asked, with a catching breath. I did, said the comedian. It is true. I didn't think there was any use. I tried to let you know with the song. Silly, said the matron. Why didn't you speak? No, no, cried the wood nymph. His way was the best. I didn't know, but it was just what I wanted, Bobby. She sprang like a green grasshopper, and the comedian opened his arms and smiled. Get out of this, roared the desk sergeant to the waiting waiter from the restaurant. There's nothing doing here for you. The Social Triangle, by O. Henry. At the stroke of 6, Icky Snigglefritz laid down his goose. Icky was a tailor's apprentice. Are there tailor's apprentices nowadays? At any rate, Icky toiled and snipped and basted and pressed and patched and sponged all day in the steamy fader of a tailor shop. But when work was done, Icky hitched his wagon to such stars as his firmament let shine. It was Saturday night, and the boss laid 12 begrimed and begrudged dollars in his hand. Icky dabbled discreetly in water, donned coat, hat, and collar with its frazzled tie and chalcedony pin, and set forth in pursuit of his ideals. For each of us, when our day's work is done, must seek our ideal, whether it be love or pinnacle or lobster a la Newburgh, or the sweet silence of the musty bookshelves. Behold Icky as he ambles up the street beneath the roaring L, between the rows of reeking sweatshops, pallid, stooping, insignificant, squalid, doomed to exist forever in penury of body and mind. Yet, as he swings his cheap cane and projects the noisome inhalations from his cigarette, you perceive that he nurtures in his narrow bosom the bacillus of society. Icky's legs carried him to and into that famous place of entertainment known as the Café McGinnis, famous because it was the rendezvous of Billy McMahon, the greatest man, the most wonderful man, Icky thought, that the world had ever produced. Billy McMahon was the district leader. Upon him the tiger purred, and his hand held manna to scatter. Now, as Icky entered, McMahon stood, flushed and triumphant and mighty, the center of a huzzaying concourse of his lieutenants and constituents. It seems there had been an election. A signal victory had been won. The city had been swept back into line by a resistless besom of ballots. Icky slunk along the bar and gazed, breath quickened, at his idol. How magnificent was Billy McMahon, with his great, smooth, laughing face, his gray eye, shrewd as a chicken hawk's, his diamond ring, his voice like a bugle call, his prince's air, his plump and active roll of money, his clarion call to friend and comrado. What a king of men he was! How he obscured his lieutenants, though they themselves loomed large and serious, blue of chin and important of mien, with hands buried deep in the pockets of their short overcoats. But Billy-o, what small avail are words to paint for you his glory as seen by Icky Snigglefritz. The Café McGinnis rang to the note of victory. The white-coated bartenders threw themselves featfully upon bottle, cork, and glass. From a score of clear Havanas the air received its paradox of clouds. The leal and the hopeful shook Billy McMahon's hand, and there was born suddenly in the worshipful soul of Icky Snigglefritz an audacious, thrilling impulse. He stepped forward into the little cleared space in which Majesty moved, and held out his hand. Billy McMahon grasped it unhesitatingly, shook it and smiled. Made mad now by the gods who were about to destroy him, Icky threw away his scabbard and charged upon Olympus. "Have a drink with me, Billy," he said familiarly. "You and your friends?" "Don't mind if I do, old man," said the great leader, just to keep the ball rolling. The last spark of Icky's reason fled. "Wine," he called to the bartender, waving a trembling hand. The corks of 3 bottles were drawn. The champagne bubbled in the long row of glasses set upon the bar. Billy McMahon took his and nodded, with his beaming smile, at Icky. The lieutenants and satellites took theirs and growled, "Here's to you." Icky took his nectar in delirium. All drank. Icky threw his week's wages in a crumpled roll upon the bar. "Correct," said the bartender, smoothing the 12 $1 notes. The crowd surged around Billy McMahon again. Someone was telling how Brannigan fixed him over in the 11th. Icky leaned against the bar a while, and then went out. He went down Hester Street and up Christie, and down Delancey to where he lived. And there his women folk, a bibulous mother and 3 dingy sisters, pounced upon him for his wages. And at his confession they shrieked and objurgated him in the pithy rhetoric of the locality. But even as they plucked at him and struck him, Icky remained in his ecstatic trance of joy. His head was in the clouds. The star was drawing his wagon. Compared with what he had achieved, the loss of wages and the bray of women's tongues were slight affairs. He had shaken the hand of Billy McMahon. Billy McMahon had a wife, and upon her visiting cards was engraved the name Mrs. William Dara McMahon. And there was a certain vexation attendant upon these cards. For, small as they were, there were houses in which they could not be inserted. Billy McMahon was a dictator in politics, a 4-walled tower in business, a mogul, dreaded, loved, and obeyed among his own people. He was growing rich. The daily papers had a dozen men on his trail to chronicle his every word of wisdom. He had been honored in caricature, holding the tiger cringing in leash. But the heart of Billy was sometimes sore within him. There was a race of men from which he stood apart, but that he viewed with the eye of Moses looking over into the promised land. He, too, had ideals, even as had Icky Snigglefritz, and sometimes, hopeless of attaining them, his own solid success was as dust and ashes in his mouth. And Mrs. William Dara McMahon wore a look of discontent upon her plump but pretty face, and the very rustle of her silks seemed a sigh. There was a brave and conspicuous assemblage in the dining saloon of a noted hostelry where fashion loves to display her charms. At one table sat Billy McMahon and his wife. Mostly silent they were, but the accessories they enjoyed little needed the endorsement of speech. Mrs. McMahon's diamonds were outshone by few in the room. The waiter bore the costliest brands of wine to their table. In evening dress, with an expression of gloom upon his smooth and massive countenance, you would look in vain for a more striking figure than Billy's. For tables away sat alone a tall, slender man, about 30, with thoughtful, melancholy eyes, a Van Dyke beard, and peculiarly white, thin hands. He was dining on filet mignon, dry toast, and apollinaris. That man was Cortlandt Van Duyckink, a man worth 80 millions, who inherited and held a sacred seat in the exclusive inner circle of society. Billy McMahon spoke to no one around him, because he knew no one. Van Duyckink kept his eyes on his plate, because he knew that everyone present was hungry to catch his. He could bestow knighthood and prestige by a nod, and he was chary of creating a too extensive nobility. And then Billy McMahon conceived and accomplished the most startling and audacious act of his life. He rose deliberately and walked over to Cortlandt Van Duyckink's table and held out his hand. "Say, Mr. Van Duyckink," he said, "I've heard you was talking about starting some reforms among the poor people down in my district. I'm McMahon, you know. Say now, if that's straight, I'll do all I can to help you. And what I says goes in that neck of the woods, don't it?" "Oh, say, I rather guess it does." Van Duyckink's rather somber eyes lighted up. He rose to his lank height and grasped Billy McMahon's hand. "Thank you, Mr. McMahon," he said, in his deep, serious tones. "I have been thinking of doing some work of that sort. I shall be glad of your assistance. It pleases me to have become acquainted with you." Billy walked back to his seat. His shoulder was tingling from the accolade bestowed by royalty. 100 eyes were now turned upon him in envy and new admiration. Mrs. William Dara McMahon trembled with ecstasy, so that her diamonds smote the eye almost with pain. And now it was apparent that at many tables there were those who suddenly remembered that they enjoyed Mr. McMahon's acquaintance. He saw smiles and bows about him. He became enveloped in the aura of dizzy greatness. His campaign coolness deserted him. "Wine for that gang," he commanded the waiter, pointing with his finger. "Wine over there. Wine to those 3 gents by that green bush. Tell 'em it's on me. D-in it. Wine for everybody." The waiter ventured to whisper that it was perhaps inexpedient to carry out the order, in consideration of the dignity of the house and its custom. "All right," said Billy, "if it's against the rules. I wonder if 'twould do to send my friend Van Duyckink a bottle? No? Well, it'll flow all right at the cafe tonight, just the same. It'll be rubber boots for anybody who comes in there any time up to 2 a.m. Billy McMahon was happy. He had shaken the hand of Cortlandt Van Duyckink. The big pale gray auto with its shining metal work looked out of place moving slowly among the pushcarts and trash heaps on the Lower East Side. So did Cortlandt Van Duyckink, with his aristocratic face and white, thin hands, as he steered carefully between the groups of ragged, scurrying youngsters in the streets. And so did Miss Constance Schuyler, with her dim, ascetic beauty, seated at his side. "Oh, Cortlandt," she breathed, "isn't it sad that human beings have to live in such wretchedness and poverty? And you, how noble it is of you to think of them, to give your time and money to improve their condition." Van Duyckink turned his solemn eyes upon her. "It is little," he said sadly, "that I can do. The question is a large one, and belongs to society. But even individual effort is not thrown away. Look, Constance, on this street I have arranged to build soup kitchens, where no one who is hungry will be turned away. And down this other street are the old buildings that I shall cause to be torn down, and there erect others in place of those death traps of fire and disease." Down Delancey slowly crept the pale gray auto. Away from it toddled coveys of wondering, tangle-haired, barefooted, unwashed children. It stopped before a crazy brick structure, foul and awry. Van Duyckink alighted to examine at a better perspective one of the leaning walls. Down the steps of the building came a young man who seemed to epitomize its degradation, squalor, and infelicity, a narrow-chested, pale, unsavory young man, puffing at a cigarette. Obeying a sudden impulse, Van Duyckink stepped out and warmly grasped the hand of what seemed to him a living rebuke. "I want to know you people," he said, sincerely. "I am going to help you as much as I can. We shall be friends." As the auto crept carefully away, Cortlandt Van Duyckink felt an unaccustomed glow about his heart. He was near to being a happy man. He had shaken the hand of Icky Snigglefritz. The Snowman, by O. Henry. Housed and window-paned from it, the greatest wonder to little children is the snow. To men, it is something like a crucible in which their world melts into a white star 10 million miles away. The man who can stand the test is a snowman, and this is his reading by Fahrenheit, Romer, or Moses's carven tablets of stone. Night had fluttered a sable pinion above the canyon of Big Lost River, and I urged my horse toward the Bay Horse Ranch because the snow was deepening. The flakes were as large as an hour's circular tatting by Miss Wilkins's ablest spinster, betokening a heavy snowfall and less entertainment and more adventure than the completion of the tatting could promise. I knew Ross Curtis of the Bay Horse, and that I would be welcome as a snowbound pilgrim, both for hospitality's sake and because Ross had few chances to confide in living creatures who did not neigh, bellow, bleat, yelp, or howl during his discourse. The ranch house was just within the jaws of the canyon where its builder may have fatuously fancied that the timbered and rocky walls on both sides would have protected it from the wintry Colorado winds. But I feared the drift. Even now, through the endless, bottomless rift in the hills, the speaking tube of the four winds came roaring the voice of the proprietor to the little room on the top floor. At my hello, a ranch hand came from an outer building and received my thankful horse. In another minute, Ross and I sat by a stove in the dining room of the four-room ranch house, while the big, simple welcome of the household lay at my disposal. Fanned by the whizzing norther, the fine, dry snow was sifted and bolted through the cracks and knotholes of the logs. The cook room, without a separating door, appended. In there I could see a short, sturdy, leisurely and weather-beaten man moving with professional sureness about his red-hot stove. His face was stolid and unreadable, something like that of a great thinker, or of one who had no thoughts to conceal. I thought his eye seemed unwarrantably superior to the elements and to the man, but quickly attributed that to the characteristic self-importance of a petty chef. Camp cook was the niche that I gave him in the Hall of Types, and he fitted it as an apple fits a dumpling. Cold it was in spite of the glowing stove, and Ross and I sat and talked, shuddering frequently, half from nerves and half from the freezing drafts. So he brought the bottle and the cook brought boiling water, and we made prodigious hot toddies against the attacks of Boreas. We clinked glasses often. They sounded like icicles dropping from the eaves, or like the tinkle of 1,000 prisms on a Louis XIV chandelier that I once heard at a boarders' dance in the parlor of a 10-a-week boarding house in Gramercy Square. Sick transit. Silence in the terrible beauty of the snow and of the Sphinx and of the stars. But they who believe that all things, from a without wine table d'hote to the crucifixion, may be interpreted through music, might have found a nocturne or a symphony to express the isolation of that blotted-out world. The clink of glass and bottle, the Aeolian chorus of the wind in the house crannies, its deeper trombone through the canyon below, and the Wagnerian crash of the cook's pots and pans, united in a fit, discordant melody, I thought. No less welcome an accompaniment was the sizzling of broiling ham and venison cutlet endorsed by the solvent fumes of true Java, bringing rich promises of comfort to our yearning souls. The cook brought the smoking supper to the table. He nodded to me democratically as he cast the heavy plates around as though he were pitching quoits or hurling the discus. I looked at him with some appraisement and curiosity and much conciliation. There was no prophet to tell us when that drifting evil outside might cease to fall, and it is well, when snowbound, to stand somewhere within the radius of the cook's favorable consideration. But I could read neither favor nor disapproval in the face and manner of our pot wrestler. He was about 5 feet 9 inches, and 200 pounds of commonplace, bull-necked, pink-faced, callous calm. He wore brown duck trousers too tight and too short, and a blue flannel shirt with sleeves rolled above his elbows. There was a sort of grim, steady scowl on his features that looked to me as though he had fixed it there purposely as a protection against the weakness of an inherent amiability that, he fancied, were better concealed. And then I let supper usurp his brief occupancy of my thoughts. "Draw up, George," said Ross. "Let's all eat while the grub's hot." "You fellows go on and chew," answered the cook. "I ate mine in the kitchen before sundown." "Think it'll be a big snow, George?" asked the ranchman. George had turned to re-enter the cook room. He moved slowly around and, looking at his face, it seemed to me that he was turning over the wisdom and knowledge of centuries in his head. "It might," was his delayed reply. At the door of the kitchen he stopped and looked back at us. Both Ross and I held our knives and forks poised and gave him our regard. Some men have the power of drawing the attention of others without speaking a word. Their attitude is more effective than a shout. "And again it mightn't," said George and went back to his stove. After we had eaten, he came in and gathered the emptied dishes. He stood for a moment, while his spurious frown deepened. "It might stop any minute," he said, "or it might keep up for days." At the farther end of the cook room, I saw George pour hot water into his dishpan, light his pipe, and put the tableware through its required lavation. He then carefully unwrapped from a piece of old saddle blanket a paperback book and settled himself to read by his dim oil lamp. And then the ranchman threw tobacco on the cleared table and set forth again the bottles and glasses. And I saw that I stood in a deep channel through which the long-dammed flood of his discourse would soon be booming. But I was half content, comparing my fate with that of the late Thomas Tucker, who had to sing for his supper, thus doubling the burdens of both himself and his host. "Snow is a hell of a thing," said Ross, by way of a foreword. "It ain't, somehow, it seems to me, salubrious. I can stand water and mud in 2 inches below zero and 110 in the shade in medium-sized cyclones. But this here fuzzy white stuff naturally gets me all locoed. I reckon the reason it rattles you is because it changes the look of things so much. It's like you had a wife and left her in the morning with the same old blue cotton wrapper on, and rides in of a night and runs across her all outfitted in a white silk evening frock, waving an ostrich feather fan, and monkeying with a posy of lily flowers. Wouldn't it make you look for your pocket compass? You'd be liable to kiss her before you collected your presence of mind." By and by, the flood of Ross's talk was drawn up into the clouds, so it pleased me to fancy, and they're condensed into the finer snowflakes of thought. And we sat silent about the stove, as good friends and bitter enemies will do. I thought of Boss's preamble about the mysterious influence upon man exerted by that ermine-lined monster that now covered our little world, and knew he was right. Of all the curious knickknacks, mysteries, puzzles, Indian gifts, rat traps, and well-disguised blessings that the gods chuck down to us from the Olympian peaks, the most disquieting and evil-bringing is the snow. By scientific analysis, it is absolute beauty and purity. So, at the beginning we look doubtfully at chemistry. It falls upon the world, and lo, we live in another. It hides in a night the old scars and familiar places with which we have grown heart-sick or enamored. So, as quietly as we can, we hustle on our embroidered robes and hie us on Prince Camaralzaman's horse or in the reindeer sleigh into the white country where the seven colors converge. This is when our fancy can overcome the bane of it. But in certain spots of the earth comes the snow madness, made known by people turned wild and distracted by the bewildering veil that has obscured the only world they know. In the cities, the white fairy who sets the brains of her dupes whirling by a wave of her wand is cast for the comedy role. Her diamond shoe buckles glitter like frost. With a pirouette she invites the spotless carnival. But in the waste places the snow is sardonic. Sponging out the world of the outliers, it gives no foothold on another sphere in return. It makes of the earth a firmament underfoot. It leaves us clawing and stumbling in space in an inimical fifth element, whose evil outdoes its strangeness and beauty. Their nature, low comedian, plays her tricks on man. Though she has put him forth as her highest product, it appears that she has fashioned him with what seems almost incredible carelessness and indexterity. One-sided and without balance, with his two halves unequally fashioned and joined, must he ever jog his eccentric way. The snow falls, the darkness caps it, and the ridiculous man-biped strays in accurate circles until he succumbs in the ruins of his defective architecture. In the throat of the thirsty the snow is vitriol. In appearance as plausible as the breakfast food of the angels, it is as hot in the mouth as ginger, increasing the pangs of the water-famished. It is a derivative from water, air, and some cold, uncanny fire from which the caloric has been extracted. Good has been said of it. Even the poets, crazed by its spell and shivering in their attics under its touch, have indeed permanent melodies commemorative of its beauty. Still, to the saddest overcoat optimist it is a plague, a corroding plague that Pharaoh successfully sidestepped. It beneficently covers the wheat fields, swelling the crop, and the flour trust gets us by the throat like a sudden quinsy. It spreads the tail of its white kirtle over the red seams of the rugged north, and the Alaskan short story is born. Etiolated perfidy, it shelters the mountain traveler burrowing from the icy air and, melting tomorrow, drowns his brother in the valley below. At its worst it is lock and key and crucible and the wand of Circe, when it corrals man in lonely ranches, mountain cabins, and forest huts. The snow makes apes and tigers of the hardiest. It turns the bosoms of weaker ones to glass, their tongues to infants' rattles, their hearts to lawlessness and spleen. It is not all from the isolation. The snow is not merely a blockader, it is a chemical test. It is a good man who can show a reaction that is not chiefly composed of a dram or two of potash and magnesia, with traces of Adam, Ananias, Nebuchadnezzar, and the fretful porcupine. This is no story, you say. Well, let it begin. There was a knock at the door. Is the opening not full of context and reminiscence? Oh, best buyers of bestsellers? We drew the latch, and in stumbled Etienne Girard, as he afterward named himself. But just then he was no more than a worm struggling for life, enveloped in a killing white chrysalis. We dug down through snow, overcoats, mufflers, and waterproofs, and dragged forth a living thing with a Van Dyke beard and marvelous diamond rings. We put it through the approved curriculum of snow, rubbing, hot milk, and teaspoonful doses of whiskey, working him up to a graduating class entitled to a diploma of 3 fingers of rye and half a glassful of hot water. One of the ranch boys had already come from the quarters at Ross's bugle-like yell and kicked the stranger's staggering pony to some sheltered corral where beasts were entertained. Let a paragraphic biography of Girard intervene. Etienne was an opera singer originally, we gathered. But adversity and the snow had made him non-compass voces. The adversity consisted of the stranded San Salvador Opera Company, a period of hotel second, story work, and then a career as a professional palmist, jumping from town to town. 4. Like other professional palmists, every time he worked the heart line too strongly, he immediately moved along the line of least resistance. Though Etienne did not confide this to us, we surmised that he had moved out into the dusk about 20 minutes ahead of a constable and had thus encountered the snow. In his most sacred blue language, he dilated upon the subject of snow, for Etienne was Paris-born and loved the snow with the same passion that an orchid does. Miserable, commented Etienne, and took another 3 fingers. Complete, cast iron, pussy-footed, blank, blank, said Ross and followed suit. Rotten, said I. The cook said nothing. He stood in the door weighing our outburst, and insistently from behind that frozen visage I got 2 messages, via the M wireless. One was that George considered our vituperation against the snow childish. The other was that George did not love Dagos. Inasmuch as Etienne was a Frenchman, I concluded I had the message wrong. So I queried the other, bright eyes, you don't really mean Dagos, do you? And over the wireless came 3 deathly, psychic taps, yes. Then I reflected that to George all foreigners were probably Dagos. I had once known another camp cook who had thought Mons, Sig, and Millie, Trans-Mississippi for MLLE, were Italian given names. This cook used to marvel therefore at the paucity of Neo-Roman precognomens, and therefore why not? I have said that snow is a test of men. For 1 day, 2 days, Etienne stood at the window, Fletcherizing his fingernails and shrieking and moaning at the monotony. To me, Etienne was just about as unbearable as the snow. And so, seeking relief, I went out on the second day to look at my horse, slipped on a stone, broke my collarbone, and thereafter underwent not the snow test, but the test of flat on the back. A test that comes once too often for any man to stand. However, I bore up cheerfully. I was now merely a spectator, and from my couch in the big room I could lie and watch the human interplay with that detached, impassive, impersonal feeling which French writers tell us is so valuable to the litterateur, and American writers to the faro dealer. I shall go crazy in this abominable, miserable place, was Etienne's constant prediction. Never knew Mark Twain to bore me before, said Ross, over and over. He sat by the other window, hour after hour, a box of Pittsburgh stogies of the length, strength, and odor of a Pittsburgh graft scandal deposited on one side of him, and Roughing It, The Jumping Frog, and Life on the Mississippi on the other. For every chapter he lit a new stogie, puffing furiously. This in time gave him a recurrent premonition of cramps, gastritis, smoker's colic, or whatever it is they have in Pittsburgh after a too-deep indulgence in graft scandals. To fend off the colic, Ross resorted time and again to old Dr. Still's amber-colored U.S.A. colic cure. Result, after 48 hours nerves. Positive fact, I never knew Mark Twain to make me tired before. Positive fact, Ross slammed Roughing It on the floor. When you're snowbound this away you want tragedy, I guess. Humor just seems to bring out all your cussedness. You read a man's poor, pitiful attempts to be funny, and it makes you so nervous you want to tear the book up, get out your bandana, and have a good, long cry. At the other end of the room, the Frenchman took his fingernails out of his mouth long enough to exclaim, "Humor! Humor at such a time as these! My God! I shall go crazy in these abominable." "Supper," announced George. These meals were not the meals of Rabelais, who said, "The great God makes the planets and we make the platters neat." By that time, the ranch house meals were not affairs of gusto. They were mental distraction, not bodily provender. What they were to be later shall never be forgotten by Ross or me or Etienne. After supper, the stogies and fingernails began again. My shoulder ached wretchedly, and with half-closed eyes I tried to forget it by watching the deft movements of the stolid cook. Suddenly I saw him cock his ear, like a dog. Then, with a swift step, he moved to the door, threw it open, and stood there. The rest of us had heard nothing. "What is it, George?" asked Ross. The cook reached out his hand into the darkness alongside the jam. With careful precision he prodded something. Then he made one careful step into the snow. His back muscles bulged a little under the arms as he stooped and lightly lifted a burden. Another step inside the door, which he shut methodically behind him, and he dumped the burden at a safe distance from the fire. He stood up and fixed us with a solemn eye. None of us moved under that Orphic suspense until— "A woman," remarked George. Miss Willie Adams was her name. Vocation, school teacher. Present avocation, getting lost in the snow. Age, yum, the Persian for 20. Take to the woods if you would describe Miss Adams. A willow for grace, a hickory for fiber, a birch for the clear whiteness of her skin. For eyes, the blue sky seen through treetops, the silken cocoons for her hair. Her voice, the murmur of the evening June wind in the leaves. Her mouth, the berries of the wintergreen. Fingers as light as ferns. Her toe as small as a deer track. General impression upon the dazed beholder who could not see the forest for the trees. Psychology, with a capital P and the foot of a lynx, at this juncture stalks into the ranch house. 3 men, a cook, a pretty young woman, all snowbound. Count me out of it, as I did not count, anyway. I never did. With women, count the cook out, if you like. But note the effect upon Ross and Etienne Girard. Ross dumped Mark Twain in a trunk and locked the trunk. Also, he discarded the Pittsburgh scandals. Also, he shaved off a 3 days beard. Etienne, being French, began on the beard first. He pomaded it from a little tube of grease hongroise in his vest pocket. He combed it with a little aluminum comb from the same vest pocket. He trimmed it with manicure scissors from the same vest pocket. His light and Gallic spirits underwent a sudden, miraculous change. He hummed a blithe San Salvador Opera Company tune. He grinned, smirked, bowed, pirouette, twiddled, twaddled, twisted, and twirled. Gaily, the notorious troubadour could not have equaled Etienne. Ross's method of advance was brusque, domineering. "Little woman," he said, "you're welcome here." And with what he thought subtle double meaning, "Welcome to stay here as long as you like, snow or no snow." Miss Adams thanked him a little wildly, some of the wintergreen berries creeping into the birch bark. She looked around hurriedly as if seeking escape, but there was none, save the kitchen and the room allotted her. She made an excuse and disappeared into her own room. Later I, feigning sleep, heard the following. "Mies Adams, I was almost to parasol die of monotony in your fair and beautiful face appear in this miserable house." I opened my starboard eye. The beard was being curled furiously around a finger. The Svengali I was rolling. The chair was being hunched closer to the school teacher's. "I am French, you see, temperamental nervous. I cannot endure these dull hours in this ranch house. But a woman comes. Ah." The shoulders gave 9 Ross and a tiger. What a difference. All is light and gay. Everything smile you smile. You have beauty, grace. My comes back to me and I feel your So. He laid his hand upon his vest pocket. From this vantage point, he suddenly snatched at the school teacher's own hand. "Ah, Mies Adams, if I could only tell you how I add." "Dinner," remarked George. He was standing just behind the Frenchman's ear. His eyes looked straight into the school teacher's eyes. After 30 seconds of survey, his lips moved deep in the flinty, frozen maelstrom of his face. "Dinner," he concluded, "will be ready in 2 minutes." Miss Adams jumped to her feet, relieved. "I must get ready for dinner," she said brightly, and went into her room. Ross came in 15 minutes late. After the dishes had been cleaned away, I waited until a propitious time when the room was temporarily ours alone, and told him what had happened. He became so excited that he lit a stogie without thinking. "Yeller, hided, unwashed, palm-readin' skunk," he said under his breath. "I'll shoot him full o' holes if he don't watch out talkin' that way to my wife." I gave a jump that set my collarbone back another week. "Your wife," I gasped. "Well, I mean to make her that," he announced. The air in the ranch house the rest of that day was tense with pent-up emotions. Oh, best buyers of bestsellers. Ross watched Miss Adams as a hawk does a hen. He watched Etienne as a hawk does a scarecrow. Etienne watched Miss Adams as a weasel does a henhouse. He paid no attention to Ross. The condition of Miss Adams, in the role of sought after, was feverish. Lately escaped from the agony and long torture of the white cold, where for hours nature had kept the little school teacher's vision locked in and turned upon herself. Nobody knows through what profound feminine introspection she had gone. Now, suddenly cast among men, instead of finding relief and security, she beheld herself plunged anew into other discomforts. Even in her own room she could hear the loud voices of her imposed suitors. "I'll blow you full o' holes," shouted Ross. "Witnesses," shrieked Etienne, waving his hand at the cook and me. She could not have known the previous harassed condition of the men, fretting under indoor conditions. All she knew was that where she had expected the frank freemasonry of the West, she found the subtle tangle of two men's minds, bent upon exacting whatever romance there might be in her situation. She tried to dodge Ross and the Frenchman by spells of nursing me. They also came over to help nurse. This combination aroused such a natural state of invalid cussedness on my part that they were all forced to retire. Once she did manage to whisper, "I am so worried here. I don't know what to do." To which I replied, gently, hitching up my shoulder, that I was a hunch savant and that the 8th house under this sign, the moon being in Virgo, showed that everything would turn out all right. But 20 minutes later I saw Etienne reading her palm and felt that perhaps I might have to recast her horoscope and try for a dark man coming with a bundle. Toward sunset, Etienne left the house for a few moments and Ross, who had been sitting taciturn and morose, having unlocked Mark Twain, made another dash. It was typical Ross talk. He stood in front of her and looked down majestically at that cool and perfect spot where Miss Adams' forehead met the neat part in her fragrant hair. First, however, he cast a desperate glance at me. I was in a profound slumber. "Little woman," he began, "it's certainly tough for a man like me to see you bothered this way. Gulp. You have been alone in this world too long. You need a protector. I might say that at a time like this you need a protector, the worst kind of protector who would take a 3-ring delight in smashing the saffron-colored kisser off of any yeller-skinned skunk that made himself obnoxious to you. Him. I am a lonely man, Miss Adams. I have so far had to carry on my life without the sweet radiance, of a woman around the house. I feel especially doggoned lonely at a time like this, when I am pretty near locoed from having to stall indoors, and hence it was with delight I welcomed your first appearance in this here shack. Since then I have been packed jam full of more different kinds of feelings, ornery, mean, dizzy, and superb, than has fallen my way in years." Miss Adams made a useless movement toward escape. The Ross chin stuck firm. "I don't want to annoy you, Miss Adams, but, by heck, if it comes to that you'll have to be annoyed. And I'll have to have my say. This palm-tickling slob of a Frenchman ought to be kicked off the place, and if you'll say the word, off he goes. But I don't want to do the wrong thing. You've got to show a preference. I'm getting around to the point, Miss Willie, in my own brick fashion. I've stood about all I can stand these last 2 days and something's got to happen. The suspense hereabouts is enough to hang a sheepherder. Miss Willie," he lassoed her hand by main force, "just say the word. You need somebody to take your part all your life long. Will you, Mar?" "Supper," remarked George tersely, from the kitchen door. Miss Adams hurried away. Ross turned angrily. "You." "I have been revolving it in my head," said George. He brought the coffee pot forward heavily, then bravely the big platter of pork and beans, then somberly the potatoes, then profoundly the biscuits. "I have been revolving it in my mind. There ain't no use waitin' any longer for Swingley. Might as well eat now." And GT, from my excellent vantage point on the couch, I watched the progress of that meal. Ross, muddled, glowering, disappointed. Etienne, eternally blandishing, attentive, ogling. Miss Adams, nervous, picking at her food, hesitant about answering questions, almost hysterical. Now and then the solid, flitting shadow of the cook, passing behind their backs like a dreadnought in a fog. I used to own a clock which gurgled in its throat 3 minutes before it struck the hour. I know, therefore, the slow freight of anticipation, for I have awakened at 3 in the morning, heard the clock gurgle, and waited those 3 minutes for the 3 strokes I knew were to come. Alors. In Ross's ranch house that night, the slow freight of climax whistled in the distance. Etienne began it after supper. Miss Acklems had suddenly displayed a lively interest in the kitchen layout, and I could see her in there, chatting brightly at George, not with him the while he ducked his head and rattled his pans. "My friend," said Etienne, exhaling a large cloud from his cigarette and patting Ross lightly on the shoulder with a beady-amonded hand which hung limp from a yard or more of bony arm. "I see I muse be frank with you. First, because we are rivals. Second, because you take these matters so serious. I am Frenchman. I love the women." He threw back his curls, bared his yellow teeth, and blew an unsavory kiss toward the kitchen. "It is, I suppose, a trait of my nation. All Frenchmen love the women, pretty women. Now look, here I am." He spread out his arms. "Cold outside. I detest the colonel. Snow. I abominate the miserable snow. 2 men. This," pointing to me, "and this," pointing to Ross. "I am distracted. For 2 whole days I stand at the window and tear my air. I am nervous, upset, found a wide distress inside my, and suddenly behold, a woman, a nice, pretty, charming, innocent young woman. I, naturally, rejoice. I become myself again gay, light-hearted, happy. I address myself to Mademoiselle. It passes the time. That, MCU, is what the women are for, pass the time. Entertainment like the music, like the wine. They appeal to the mood, the caprice, the temperament. To play with these women, follow her through her humor, pursue her, that is the most delightful way to send the hours about their business." Ross banged the table. "Shut up, you miserable yeller pup," he roared. "I object to your pursuing anything or anybody in my house. Now, you listen to me, you." He picked up the box of stogies and used it on the table as an emphasizer. The noise of it awoke the attention of the girl in the kitchen. Unheeded, she crept into the room. "I don't know anything about your French ways of lovemaking, and I don't care. In my section of the country, it's the best man wins. And I'm the best man here, and don't you forget it. This girl's going to be mine. There ain't going to be any playing, or philandering, or palm reading about it. I've made up my mind I'll have this girl, and that settles it. My word is the law in this neck o' the woods. She's mine, and as soon as she says she's mine, you pull out." The box made one final, tremendous punctuation point. Etienne's bravado was unruffled. "Ah, that is no way to win a woman," he smiled, easily. "I make prophecy you will never win her that way. No, not this woman. She muse be played along and then kissed, this charming, delicious little creature. One kiss, and then you ave her." Again he displayed his unpleasant teeth. "I make you a bet I will kiss her." As a cheerful chronicler of deeds done well, it joys me to relate that the hand which fell upon Etienne's amorous lips was not his own. There was one sudden sound, as of a mule kicking a lath fence, and then through the swinging doors of oblivion for Etienne. I had seen this blow delivered. It was an aloof, unstudied, almost absent-minded affair. I had thought the cook was rehearsing the proper method of turning a flapjack. Silently, lost in thought, he stood there scratching his head. Then he began rolling down his sleeves. "You'd better get your things on, miss, and we'll get out of here," he decided. "Wrap up warm." I heard her heave a little sigh of relief as she went to get her cloak, sweater, and hat. Ross jumped to his feet and said, "George, what are you going to do?" George, who had been headed in my direction, slowly swiveled around and faced his employer. "Being a camp cook, I ain't overburdened with hosses," George enlightened us. "Therefore, I'm going to try to borrow this feller's here." For the first time in 4 days my soul gave a genuine cheer. "If it's for Lachinvar purposes, go as far as you like," I said grandly. The cook studied me a moment, as if trying to find an insult in my words. "No," he replied. "It's for mine and the young lady's purposes, and we'll go only 3 miles to Hicksville. Now let me tell you something, Ross." Suddenly I was confronted with the cook's chunky back and I heard a low, curt, carrying voice shoot through the room at my host. George had wheeled just as Ross started to speak. You're nutty. That's what's the matter with you. You can't stand the snow. You're getting nervouser and nuttier every day. That and this Dago, he jerked a thumb at the half-dead Frenchman in the corner, has got you to the point where I thought I'd better horn in. I got to revolving it around in my mind and I seen if something wasn't done, and done soon, there'd be murder around here and maybe, his head gave an imperceptible list toward the girl's room, worse. He stopped, but he held up a stubby finger to keep anyone else from speaking. Then he plowed slowly through the drift of his ideas. About this here woman. I know you, Ross, and I know what you really think about women. If she hadn't happened in here during this here snow, you'd never have given two thoughts to the whole woman question. Likewise, when the storm clears and you and the boys go hustling out, this here whole business'll clear out of your head, and you won't think of a skirt again until kingdom come. Just because o' this snow here, don't forget you're living in the self-same world you was in 4 days ago. And you're the same man too. Now, what's the use o' getting all snarled up over 4 days of stickin' in the house? That there's what I've been revolvin' in my mind, and this here's the decision I've come to. He plodded to the door and shouted to one of the ranch hands to saddle my horse. Ross lit a stogie and stood thoughtful in the middle of the room. Then he began. I've a darn good notion, George, to knock your confounded head off and throw you into that snowbank. You're wrong, mister. That ain't a darned good notion you've got. It's darn bad. Look here. He pointed steadily out of doors until we were both forced to follow his finger. You're in here for more'n a week yet. After allowing this fact to sink in, he barked out at Ross, Can you cook? Then at me, Can you cook? Then he looked at the wreck of Etienne and sniffed. There was an embarrassing silence as Ross and I thought solemnly of a foodless week. If you just use hoss sense, concluded George, and don't go for to hurt my feelin's, all I want to do is to take this young gal down to Hicksville, and then I'll head back here and cook fare you. The horse and Miss Adams arrived simultaneously, both of them very serious and quiet. The horse because he knew what he had before him in that weather. The girl because of what she had left behind. Then all at once I awoke to a realization of what the cook was doing. My God, man! I cried, Aren't you afraid to go out in that snow? Behind my back I heard Ross mutter, Not him. George lifted the girl daintily up behind the saddle, drew on his gloves, put his foot in the stirrup, and turned to inspect me leisurely. As I passed slowly in his review, I saw in my mind's eye the algebraic equation of snow, the equal sign, and the answer in the man before me. Snow is my last name, said George. He swung into the saddle, and they started cautiously out into the darkening swirl of fresh new currency just issuing from the snowdrop mint. The girl, to keep her place, clung happily to the sturdy figure of the camp cook. I brought 3 things away from Ross Curtis's ranch house. Yes, 4. One was the appreciation of snow, which I have so humbly tried here to render. 2 was a collarbone, of which I am extra careful. 3 was a memory of what it is to eat very extremely bad food for a week. And 4 was the cause of 3, a little note delivered at the end of the week and hand-painted in blue pencil on a sheet of meat paper. I cannot come back there to that their job. Mrs. Snow say no, George. I've been revolving it in my mind. Considerin' circumstances she's right.